Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Cranky Old Historian, and I apologize for being gone for a couple of weeks now. I've had the old man cold, and still haven't really shaken it. So if you hear me talking a little nasally, that's why. Today I wanted to talk a little prequel to my last video, which was about the beginning of the Atlanta campaign, or about the overview of the Atlanta campaign. Today I want to talk about a battle in northwest Georgia and a really outstanding ghost story. And they both occurred in the same place. This is a place called Chickamauga. And Chickamauga is a very interesting part of northwest Georgia, not terribly far north of where I'm sitting right now. And it was an area that has been haunted, if you want to call that, for a very, very long time. Before the Civil War, when the first European settlers came up into that area, and they were counting Cherokee Indians who lived there. Now, bear in mind, Cherokees are not native to this area. Like most Native American nations, they moved around. Cherokees are actually Iroquois from the New York area. And they had moved into that area not terribly long before the Europeans started moving in. They were actually fairly new, and relatively speaking. And when the settlers came in there, they found this beautiful, lush valley, well-watered, great farmland. I mean, really great, and great hunting land and all this. And so they were asking that, but there was no natives living there. And they were used to this idea by that time that Native American nations would have agreements. Okay, this is a mutual hunting ground. Manhattan was one of those. That nobody really owns. This is nobody's land. That everybody just shares it. And they kind of figured that's what it was. Well, they talked to the Cherokee, and they said, "Oh no, nobody goes there. No, there's monsters there." And they were very adamant about that. And they said, well, what do you call this area? They said, well, we don't call it anything. The old ones, the people who were there before the Cherokee, which is not well recorded who they were, called it Chickamauga. And they said it meant either place of death or river of death. Now, the European settlers, being European settlers, went, woohoo, well, we'll just move there. We don't care. That's fine. And they started moving up there in the late 1700s. And almost immediately, they started encountering some discomforting elements, ghosts. And if you've listened to me before, you know what I think about ghosts. They're demons. And this was a demon-haunted place. And one that they kept describing over and over was what sounded like an Eastern European vampire, to be honest, the vampire legends. It was dressed all in black, had glowing green eyes. It sort of hovered or flew, had very raggedy black clothing, and very typical of demon encounters. They reported it had this tremendously awful smell, and they also had this terrible feeling of doom whenever they were around it. It was terrifying. So you already had this leading up to well before the Civil War. There was a lot of sightings well before it and all this. So this was not new by the Civil War. Now let me skip ahead a little bit, and I'm going to talk personally because I have personally seen this demon. And let me explain how. Back in the 1980s, I was teaching high school, and I got a contract to write a book, a travel book, about Civil War sites. And this particular company, Insider's Guides out of Mateo, North Carolina, great company that got absorbed by larger and larger companies. It no longer exist, at least except for the imprint. Great people. They wanted, instead of having travel writers writing a little bit of history about some area and then a whole lot of travel, they wanted the opposite. They wanted historians to write about historical travel areas, and then they would teach us how to be travel writers. And originally, the concept was to have one author for each state. And originally, they hired me to do the Georgia part. And that changed over time like they always do. And I ended up writing my first book, which was Insider's Guide to the Civil War Sites in the Southern States. I wrote about everything in the Western Carolinas and Florida theater, instead of the Eastern theater, which, as I've mentioned before, is Virginia, Maryland, and boy, my mind just went bing today, Pennsylvania. Sorry, I'm really not feeling super well, but I wanted to talk about this. It makes me feel a little better to talk about all this, so please excuse me. I was working on the Chickamauga chapter, and I knew about Chickamauga. I knew what had happened there. I knew all, but I'd never been there at this point. So I thought, okay, it's time for me to go over there. I got to do all the travel stuff and find the hotels and restaurants and stuff like that to write the travel portion. So I went up there, and one day, I had some friends in the reenactment community, and great people, and I shot with them. I used to shoot competitive black powder. I was never good at it, but I sure did enjoy it. And a lot of these guys who shot that, were reenactors. So I was supposed to have dinner in Lafayette, which is just south of this battlefield. So I had some time, and I needed to get some pictures of the battlefield. And I'd been there a couple of times and gone to them. But to take pictures of monuments and sites, it's better to do it at dawn or dusk when the lighting is more dramatic and it's more interesting. So I traveled up there a few hours before I was supposed to meet my friends. And I was up in an area of the battlefield called Snodgrass Ridge. Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill, that was where the end of the battle took place. And I'll get back to more of that in a minute. But I was up there, and I was taking pictures of all the monuments and all this, and the place was deserted. To be honest, pretty much every time I went up there back in those days, and this was the 90s, there wasn't a lot of people there. And I really did not know a lot about this battlefield. I didn't know the lore of it. So, I was actually in a place where I probably didn't want to hang around, but I didn't know that at the time. So went up there and I took the pictures, and then I was just sort of hanging out, and I was up on Snodgrass Ridge, and there's a lot of monuments there, and just a lot of them. And I was just sort of hanging out, and kind of, battlefields are very calm, soothing places, ironically enough, and I really enjoyed going to most of them. This one I felt uncomfortable the whole time I was there. I couldn't, it's like an itch you can't scratch. I just couldn't put my finger on it. It's like I just don't understand why I'm so uncomfortable. But I took pictures of them, and I kept getting this feeling someone was watching me. And I kept looking around, and there's a lot of monuments somebody can be around, and there may be somebody. And finally I said, heck with this. I'm going to pack up my stuff and go. Well, this ridge goes up a hill, Snodgrass Hill. And the trail from the parking lot up there runs right next to the Woodland. And I'm packing up my stuff, and there is no wind. It's dead calm. And I look down, I see some bushes moving. Okay. And this is lower Appalachia, and it's not unusual to have wild dogs around, or pigs, or deer or bear or whatever. So I just kind of need to keep my eye on this to make sure I'm okay. And packed up my stuff, walked down the trail, and I get to where I'd seen those bushes moving, right next to the trail. So I turned and I looked, and all I saw was a pair of glowing green eyes looking out from the brush. And it didn't scare me. It was like you'd taken a flashlight and shown them in the eyes of a cat. It was that kind of luminescent green. And I thought, okay, that's odd. And I was very uncomfortable, but I wasn't scared. I was very uncomfortable. And I said, okay, well, let's just move on down the hill. And I kind of kept looking back, and I didn't see anything. Got in my car, drove away, and drove down to Lafayette. And met with my friends, and we were eating dinner and all this. And they were telling me that they were going to do something illegal and risky that night. No, I'm not going to name them because the statute of limitations is probably still not up. They were going to camp overnight, and this is around the time of the battle itself. It is in September, so it was close to the anniversary of the battle. And they were going to go up there, and they were going to take place in this reenactment nearby. Very, very, very few reenactments are actually held on the battlefield themselves, mostly because the National Park Service doesn't want the place torn up, and number two, there's a lot of monuments around which are hard to maneuver around. They told me that they were going to go up there and they were going to camp on Snodgrass Hill, and I'm like, can you do that? And they said, oh no, but we're going to be back in the woods, and and so we're just going to set up our tents back there in the woods, and we'll be okay. Rangers won't see us, because hardly anybody goes up there at night. Okay. I said, oh, by the way, I was just up there, and y'all might want to be careful, because I think there's some wild dogs or something up in the area. And they all looked at me, and I said, what do you mean? I told them what I'd seen. Literally every one of them just recoiled and said, you saw old Green Eyes. And I went, what? No, you saw old Green Eyes. I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, then they proceeded to tell me the story. Now let's go back to the battle. In early September 1863, things were not going well for the Confederacy. And the Union had grabbed Chattanooga, pretty much taken almost all of Tennessee, and they would do so rapidly in the next few months. So they pretty much controlled that area. Gettysburg, of course, had pushed the Army of Northern Virginia back into Virginia and away from their Pennsylvania invasion. So the sole Western Army, or the major Western, it wasn't the sole, the major Western Army was the Army of Tennessee. And the commanding general was an unfortunate man named Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg was a typical, in my mind, typical Confederate commander who was really, really good as a divisional commander, maybe even as a corps commander, but he was an absolute disaster as an army commander. His men loathed him. I read a memoir some years ago where it's talking about that they heard old Braxton Bragg was dead, and the nicest thing, the most Christian thing they could think to say is, well, he's gone now. That tells you a lot. And that was from one of the men who fought under him, and they really didn't like him. And he was a man who was prickly sort, and you follow his orders to the letter or else, even when he was dead wrong, which was often. So he got wind that the Union armies were moving, and he suspected correctly that they were going to try to invade Georgia. They were heading towards Atlanta. Atlanta, in 1863, all through the Civil War, was a major target for the Union. This is what they wanted to grab. And my Atlanta campaign series really goes into depth about that. It's a critical city for the war, not just for the theater. So he managed to get permission from Jefferson Davis to move his armies out of Atlanta, out of that area, and move up into northwest Georgia. And he suspected, he actually had a pretty good battle plan. It wasn't bad. And he suspected the Union Army was going to move down in multiple columns and try to hit either from Alabama, northeastern Alabama, or right where Georgia and Tennessee meet at the very northwestern tip, which is very mountainous. Now, on the other hand, there was a Union commander named Rosecrans. Rosecrans was another one of the unfortunate Union generals who was almost completely incompetent, but his men loved him. And he did exactly that. He was moving out under Grant's command, and Grant at that time was still commander of the armies of the West. And Grant ordered him to do exactly what Bragg expected. He was going to move into northwest Georgia and northeastern Alabama and move down in 3 columns and pierce through, and wherever he encountered the Confederate Army of Tennessee, then he could surround them, outflank them, defeat them, and then there'd be an open road to Atlanta. You see this over and over in the Civil War, where there's critical battles. The Battle of Gettysburg. If Lee had won there was an open road to Washington. It's all of these kind of battles like this, where one battle is so critical, and there's so many of these in the Civil War. And Chickamauga was very critical. So what happened was, I believe it was the 17th of September, 1863, the two armies had a meeting engagement, and that's a military term meaning where they didn't know exactly where each other was. They didn't have great intelligence, and they just simply moved forward until they made contact, a meeting engagement, and wherever they met, they fought. And they met at a mill just south of the Chickamauga area itself, and had a fairly rugged little cavalry battle there between two forces. And that's when both commanders realized, okay, here's where the other army is, and let's move everybody up. And they did. Bragg called for reinforcements, and Lee in Virginia very reluctantly gave up one of his corps under Longstreet, old Pete Longstreet. And Longstreet moved down by rail and actually arrived on the second night of the battle. Big battle. Ended up being the second most costly battle of the entire Civil War, second only to Gettysburg. If I remember correctly, there was 57,000 killed, missing, and wounded and captured on both sides. Long story short, I'm not going to get into all the particulars of the battle, but they fought back and forth across a single road, the Lafayette Road, which later became Highway 27, I believe it was. And for many, many years, that highway just ran right through the battlefield, right through the middle of it. Just the same road as it was in Civil War times. Fought back and forth. And then on the third day, Longstreet had come up the night before. The Union commander Rosecrans was advised by a dispatch rider that there was a hole in his line at a part of the line called the Brotherton Cabin, which is right in the middle of where the battle was being fought. And there wasn't a hole there. These people, these men that were holding that part of the line were actually down in a trench, a big ditch, and he just didn't see them. So Rosecrans gave orders to the army commander, to the divisional commander there, whose name I just can't remember, and ordered him to pull out of that line and to pull out of where he was and go and plug this other part of the line. Well, this other commander knew that line was holding. It was fine. It was no problem at all. But he had just been chewed out. He had just been chewed out by Rosecrans for not immediately obeying an order, so he immediately obeyed it and moved out. Longstreet's men had come in the night before and had a raid on that line, and unbeknownst to Rosecrans, Bragg had planned a charge for that day with his corps, his extra corps, Longstreet's corps, in the middle of it, pushing through. Well, when they charged, they went right into that empty spot that had just been vacated, and they were like, "Whoa, what's going on?" And they didn't know what's going on, but Rosecrans headquarters had 0 troops between it and that hole in the line, and it was only about a mile or so behind that line. And here all of a sudden comes, 32,000 screaming Confederate troops, and Union line broke. There was a couple of holdouts. Colonel Wilder had a unit that was equipped with Sharp's repeating rifles, and they were able to hold a part of the battlefield briefly on the south part. But for the most part, the Union troops either broke and simply ran, or they pulled back under fire, did a retreat under fire, and pulled back to Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. And there, that hill is really, really steep. It's a great defensive place. All the Confederate armies were centered on that point. They all eventually pulled up to that point, fighting the whole way, and then tried to assault Snodgrass Hill. They did 27 separate assaults up that hill. The last 3, they were completely out of ammunition, and it was by bayonet and sword only. Imagine that. Vicious hand-to-hand fighting. Finally, a relief force, against orders, Union relief force came over from a little town called Ringgold. They had seen what was going on. They'd heard what's going on. They asked permission from somebody, I don't remember who it was, to move, and was denied. And they said, screw it, let's go anyhow, because these guys are getting slaughtered. And they moved up, and got into line just in time to push back the last Confederate assault, and then did a fighting retreat all the way back to Chattanooga. By that time, everybody, and I mean everybody, was just exhausted. They were completely out of strength. They've been fighting for hours, and they've been fighting all day. They were exhausted, dropping where they were, and Confederates were unable to continue the assault. They could have wiped out Rosecrans's army if they had pursued him, but they just didn't have the juice left to do it, and they'd thrown all their reserves into line, and so they had nobody else to call on. So they all collapsed there. So that was the end of the battle, but not the end of the story. Many years later, here I am sitting in the Atlanta archives, and I'm reading diaries and letters from people who were there, original ones. And I'm here to tell you, in the quiet archives, and all you hear is a little hum of the air conditioning fans, and it's deadly quiet in there. It is something else to be reading letter after letter and report after report, all saying almost word for word the same thing, and it's creepy as all get out. And the angel of death was seen floating around the heaps of dead. The specter of the angel of death was seen floating above the piles of dead. There were literal piles of casualties, which was are the dead and the wounded and the dying. And you can imagine the screaming and carrying on that was going on from the wounded. And a lot of trees had been set on fire, and they talked about that in these letters, how they served as torches to light up this ghastly scene. And then on top of that, there was a couple of local units, local to that area, Fort Oglethorpe, Lafayette, others. And the ladies, the wives, girlfriends, so forth, of these soldiers traveled to the battlefield to try to find their men. And every once in a while, they would find one in one of these piles, or laying off by himself. And these letters and diaries all say the same thing, that these screams were like the screams of banshees as these women found their dead. And the ghostly sight of them walking around the battlefield with their lanterns sent a shiver up their spines. I cannot imagine a more ghastly scene than this. I honestly can't. It takes your breath away just to even think about it. And then let's fast forward a little bit. After the war, Civil War battlefields, all of them, became noted for ghost stories. You know, you have something like that happen. This was vicious combat. Vicious. The whole war. And to have the wounded and the dead and all this, it just attracts demons. You can see how this would. So you had all kind of stories pop up that kind of morphed into stories from before the Civil War. And one of the stories was that on the anniversary of the battle, and occasionally you'd see references to other times of the year, if you looked up to Horseshoe Ridge, you would see the ghostly images of lanterns floating above the battlefield. And this is the ghosts of these women looking for their men. And occasionally you'd hear stories about banshee screams and all that. But the most stories had to do with a specter that so many people talked about. It is truly unreal how many talked about this. And this is the specter of the angel of death floating around over these piles of dead. And so many spoke of this. And then after the Civil War, every so often people would report that they were in the area and they encountered this ghostly, glowing, green-eyed demon, ghost, whatever. And it was kind of sporadic, but until the 1970s, and I don't know why the 1970s became this way, but it's all of a sudden there's this explosion of sightings of this demon. And matter of fact, on two separate occasions during the 1970s, people reported that they were driving down the highway. Now, a major state highway through the middle of this battlefield. And wouldn't be done today. And matter of fact, they have done a bypass in the last 20 years or so around the battlefield. But until then, if you wanted to go north, you drove right through this battlefield. On 2 separate occasions, drivers reported they were simply driving up this thing at night. Fog rolled in, and the next thing they know, something is leaping at their windshields that had glowing green eyes. They jerked the wheel, ran off, crashed, and in each one of those instances, someone died. This is factual. This document, well documented. And ever since then, there's been frequent sightings of this. So this is the story that my friends told me that night. And they were just, oh, you have seen old Green Eyes. I went, yeah, I guess I did. I don't know. And they started telling me all these stories, and that led on to other ghost stories, which I'll tell at some other point because I don't have all that much more time left in this. But I left, and I had to go back home, and they were going to stay up there. And okay. And to go back home from where I was living, the fastest way was to drive back to the park. Well, I am not ashamed to say that thought gave me pause. After hearing all this stuff and knowing what I'd run into, I just didn't want to go back through this park again. But I finally said, oh, quit being stupid. Just drive through the park. So I drove back through the park. And the thing is, when you get close to the north end of the battlefield park, where the visitor center is and the museum, Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge are over to your left, and you can see them from the road. So I'm driving along, and I'm just I'm driving along, and I said, don't look over there, don't look over there, don't look over there. I looked over there. Yep, I saw the lights. And I'm not going to talk anything more about it. So I got home. When I got home, my wife met me and said, the phone has been ringing off the hook. It's those blankety-blank friends of yours. Really? Oh, okay. Well, the phone rang about then. This is way before cell phones. This is before we had cell phones. Most people had cell phones. And I answered the phone, and they're like, hey, dude, did you go back through the park? I said, yeah. I did. Did you see the lights? Yes, I saw the lights. And I said, wait a second. I thought you guys were camping out up there. Oh, not anymore. We're not. I said, why? He said, well, we went up there and we set up, and we were setting up, and it was after dark. And then, so-and-so hollered and said, hey, man, the lights are out here on Horseshoe Ridge. And we ran out of the woods, and we looked, and, there's like some cannon, some monuments, and said, yeah, there's these orbs, these ghostly orbs floating out there among all these monuments, all that. And said, we're all watching them. And then so-and-so came running out from the tree line, and, man, that's not funny, guys. And we were all like, what are you talking about? He said, man, y'all have been running the tents. Well, that's actually an old Civil War thing that the reenactors kind of do. And you got to bear in mind that all of us are basically 12 years old at heart. And running the tents was something that the Civil War troops and reenactors today do for fun. Have you ever seen the lines of tents? And I'll get Pet to throw a picture up here. The lines of tents in rows. And for great fun, they think it's hilarious to go running down the row of tents. And of course, you're stomping on anybody who's inside, and just high hilarity. 1863 version. And welcome to Jackass. 1863. He thought we were running it. Dude, we're all out here. We haven't been running this. So we turned and looked, and we saw these glowing green eyes in the wood line, and we just left. I said, what'd you do with all your gear? We left it there. They can have it. We're not going back. And that was old Green Eyes. That story kind of got to me. And then it's like, okay, well, have I been back up there? Yes. Have I enjoyed it? No, I really don't. It's an intensely haunted battlefield. Demon-infested battlefield, and old Green Eyes is by far not the only one. There has been a number of deaths on that battlefield that are very weird and very odd. And on top of that, I was talking to a Chattanooga detective some years ago, just on an unrelated matter, and I mentioned Chickamauga, and he said, ooh, I'd stay away from that place if I was you. I said, and I was expecting him to say something about the demons. I said, well, why? He said, because that's a favored dumping spot for murder victims from Chattanooga. Oh, because it's a major highway. It's fairly close to Chattanooga, which is a major urban area, and you've got people who murder other people there. And it's got all kind of little side roads you can go into and just dump a body off and leave, and no one will ever see it. There's no cameras. There's no nothing. So, but this is the story of Old Green Eyes, and it is still seen occasionally today. I personally think it's simply a demon that's been there since time immemorial. And the events of what happened there were so overwhelming that it just kind of takes your breath away. Like I said, this is the second costliest single battle of the entire Civil War. Third, if you count Antietam. But Antietam was a one-day battle. Gettysburg and Chickamauga were 3-day battles. So you had huge casualties, in just those 3 battles. Massive casualties. And that's my story of Chickamauga. Chickamauga was technically a Confederate victory. Technically. But Bragg had pretty much exhausted his army. And he did not like that idea. And he got up there and said a lot of very unpleasant things and accused his own command of cowardice and accused them of all sorts of stuff. And we're not going to have this. And, basically force marched them up to Chattanooga. And that's where there was another battle at Chattanooga and at a little associated place called Missionary Ridge, which you've probably heard about. And that actually laid the groundwork for the Atlanta campaign, which kicked off, the following spring in May 1864. Are there ghost stories? Yes. Are ghosts real? Yes. But they are demons. You don't want to go messing with them. This is not a battlefield I would encourage you to visit. It's got a great museum, honestly. And the people who work there are first-rate people. I really have enjoyed working with the people. Back when I was working on my books, I worked with the rangers there pretty closely, and just wonderful people. But it's even you could tell, they were professionals, and they couldn't say everything out loud, but you could tell it's like, okay, this is not a place to hang around for fun. This is not a place to go on a Sunday picnic. No, it's not a very good place. Are there physical dangers there? I don't know. There was a person who fell out of a tower there back, I believe, in the 70s also, the Wilder Tower, which I was mentioning earlier. That has got some stories about it. But that's the first ghost story I wanted to tell you about the Civil War. And I've got more to tell you. I think it makes things interesting because you have the sheer facts of the matter are interesting. That was an interesting battle, 3-day battle, even vicious battle, hard fought, back and forth across that highway. These were 2 pretty much equally matched armies just having at each other as hard as they could. And when you go there and you see all the monuments, you see how packed in they were. Matter of fact, there's a lot of Union monuments that have an oak nut, an acorn on top of them. And those are indicating the regiments and other units that stood on the top of Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge under George H. Thomas, who was the Rock of Chickamauga. And he said they stood like a mighty oak with him. Can you imagine being out of ammunition? And here the Confederates are. They're out of ammunition. And they've got their dander up. And they're fixing bayonets. And you can hear it. Because they're pretty close to each other. And then they raise that rebel yell. And they come up that hill. Would you have stood? I'll be honest, I don't know if I would have. I do not know if I would have had that much courage, but these men did. I'm a Confederate to heart. All my people were Confederate, but you got to give it to the Union troops who stood there, who stood like a mighty oak. And that is this edition of the Cranky Old Historian. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you here again. Y'all have a great, great week.